Hello, everyone. This week, our group did our presentation on suffrage and abolitionism. I wanted to include this quote to kind of give a sense as to what most women's mindsets were as they began their movement to fight for what they believed was right and just. My name is Hannah Doofman, and I am going to be breaking down our first reading of this week, the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. This document was read aloud at the Seneca Falls Convention, which is the first women's rights convention. And as you probably discovered, even just skimming through the document firsthand, you probably noticed that there was a structure to the document. There was the introduction, the list of grievances, and then finally their resolutions. One of the most notable aspects of the introduction is the inclusion of the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. However, they included men and women in the preamble. So, why do you think that they included this? As for my personal speculation, I believe that they included this to express how they had the right to fight for the rectification of the wrongs that they were currently experiencing. So, as you read through the grievances, if you are like me, you took notice of the language that the author used. So, that led me to wonder who is the he and who is the author exactly trying to hold accountable? Upon giving it some thought, I came to the conclusion that it was the male superiority that was going on at the time that truly led to most of their grievances that they listed, such as the forcing of women into submission, withholding women their rights, such as voting and franchisement, the unfair divorce laws, the double standards, especially in regards to chastity, and not allowing women to publicly worship, meaning preaching, and also withholding education from women. So then that leads us to the resolutions section, where they presented the resolutions that they wanted to see. So this is up for interpretation, but what did you find to be their strongest argument? One argument that I found as I was looking through the resolutions was how they used previous separate social spheres, like gender spheres, as kind of like an argument to back up their claims, which you can see in this last quote. So I will give you a few seconds to pause and read this lengthy quote. The reason why I believe they are incorporating separate spheres is because of the language used. Words such as righteous, morals, and religion are the things that women were already expected to bring into their domestic homes to teach their sons and daughters. So, through the logic which previously oppressed them, they present as a solid argument for their right to public speak, especially as teachers and preachers. It's kind of ironic, yet ingenious. Finally, I wanted to show you guys the signatures that they got on the document. There was about 300 people that attended the convention, but this was signed by 100 of the attendees, 68 of which were women and 32 were men.
We're going to start with the Lucy Stone Progress Report. This progress report is just commenting on what she saw as the successes and stories of the women's rights movement just a few years after the Women's Seneca Falls Convention. This is in 1856. So she goes through some of the successes, like statutes, changed laws, changed all across America, such as the Massachusetts property law. This allowed women not only to own land, but also to earn money from the land they owned, something in other states wasn't necessarily the case. She also talks about young Wisconsin, and I thought this was interesting because Wisconsin was young because it had only been officially created a few years prior. So young Wisconsin had already started off with all the women's rights that they wanted, excluding suffrage. Otherwise, every other right was there. She also goes to mention close, like Nebraska suffrage. Nebraska suffrage, the movement for suffrage, failed in the Senate, but it passed the Assembly. And she talks about how scores of women would have moved to live there, so they would soon be citizens rather than subjects. And this is important because it shows just how far some of the states and the nation as a whole had come in just a few short years. Now we're going to move on to the Sarah Parker Remond on American Slavery document. Now this is a foreigner's view of her speaking in London. So the description of Remond I found to be very interesting because it's not like something you would have seen in the United States. The writer goes and calls her a lady of color, not a free black woman, but rather a lady of color, putting her up on a pedestal already, saying that there's importance there, there's value, something you probably wouldn't have seen in the US. And he also writes, the people listened with great attention, signifying that they were interested, they wanted to hear more. Her arguments. One of the things she commented on was the slave is treated worse than criminals. That's hard to do, but she's saying that the slave is treated worse than criminals, and the writer goes into that, including where they explain the difference between a poor English woman and a slave woman. The English woman is at least free and has the children of their own. The slave woman is a victim to the lust and cruelty of their master. It's important, the difference here, to see the description of how others in foreign countries viewed the slave and how they saw the arguments against slavery. Here's a quote I just wanted to share from Lucy Stone. 200 years hence that bill will be quoted as a proof of the barbarianism of the time. Now it is proof of progress. She's saying that currently, as the time of her saying this is a monumental movement in the right direction. But she's saying in the future, we'll look back on it and say, how was this ever the case? And that's important because it's that although they know they're moving forward, they still know that they have a long way to go. And some food just for thought. How do quotes like Lucy Stone's quote on the previous page and other leading women at the time reflect just how important the work they were doing?
Our third reading for the week was Sowing the Seeds of Black Feminism by Yi. So this chapter by Yi is just one of many from her book called Black Women Abolitionists that really explores the roles of women in color during the abolition movement. Here we are able to see that there were two sides to women's involvement in abolition. There was kind of the white middle class women's attempts and the black women's attempts. It kind of frames abolition in a new perspective in this way, where we see that there were multiple groups that were fighting. It wasn't just the whitewashed version of history that we typically see. Another big thing that this reading addressed is the woman question. So sexual equality was also on the line during this fight. Abolition and sexual equality were two big ideals that really united all of these women, regardless of race. This is where we start to see this natural intersection of feminism and abolition as these women fought to, one, have their voices heard, and two, put an immediate end to slavery. Some of the ways that we can make connections between some of the concepts we've previously talked about in this course is separate spheres and perceptions of women. So this reading is a perfect example of how separate spheres and these perceptions of women were both a challenge and an advantage for Black female abolitionists. We see many men opposing their partition in various different abolitionist conferences, yet some still really upheld the idea that women are highly moral and responsible for the morality of the country. For example, Frederick Douglass was a huge proponent for women's rights and still held to the belief that women's moral superiority and delicacy. He stated in an editorial that women's intelligence and moral superiority were the exact perfect reasons to grant them political rights. And here's a quote from that editorial called Ladies. So we basically see him arguing that because of women's moral directive and benevolent nature, society, as society saw them, they were explicitly qualified for political rights. They should have political rights if they are the moral compass of the country. Then just a couple questions to consider about this reading is, how does this intersection of abolition and feminism help us understand the struggles of women of color during this time?
and then describe the inevitable clashing that occurred between white feminist abolition groups and black feminist abolition groups.